On my daughter's wedding day, my son-in-law pointed at the corner of the parking lot and sneered, "That's your spot. Don't embarrass us by parking near the entrance." It was said with a smirk in front of guests, as though my place in the family could be measured by the distance of a faded yellow line on cracked asphalt. I remember the silence that followed, the way my own children lowered their eyes, pretending they hadn't heard, pretending they agreed. The laugh that spread after was sharp, like glass breaking inside me. Every morning after that, I parked in that corner space, the one they decided was mine. My car with its peeling paint and cracked leather seats became their favorite joke. "Look at that rust bucket," they whispered. "He should be grateful we even let him park here." They thought they were clever, thought they were putting me in my place. What they never saw was how tightly my hands gripped the steering wheel each time, not from anger, but from the force it took to stay silent. That parking spot became a stage for their mockery. My son rolled his eyes whenever I pulled in. My daughter smiled politely to guests, then muttered, "Dad insists on that corner. It suits him, really." And my son-in-law, always loudest, said, "Out of sight, out of the way. That's where he belongs." They laughed as if the spot itself had stripped me of dignity, as if distance from the front door proved I no longer mattered. But what they didn't understand was that I chose that spot for a reason. Long before they were old enough to mock me, long before my son-in-law wore his smug smile, I parked there in a car just as worn out, carrying tools in the trunk, stepping out with tired hands that had spent the night pouring concrete and the day drawing plans. That corner had been the only space available when the building was still skeleton beams, when I was too young to afford pride but too stubborn to give up. They saw rust and cracks. I saw memory. They saw an old man pushed to the margins. I saw the beginning of everything they took for granted. And so I let them laugh. I let them whisper. I let them believe I was shrinking, fading, settling for less. Because I knew the truth hidden in silence. One day, they would realize that the spot they mocked was only the shadow of the foundation they stood on. And when that day came, no amount of laughter would save them from the weight of my name. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Please write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has something like this ever happened to you? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video, because that's how you help us grow this channel and bring you more stories every day. Now, let's continue. They thought I couldn't hear them, but whispers carry farther than people realize, especially when they are sharpened with mockery. Standing on the curb, I felt the words roll toward me like stones being tossed without mercy. "He comes every morning, parking in the same place, like he owns something," one voice said. Another laughed. "That car of his is falling apart, just like him." They didn't dare speak louder, because cruelty is always more comfortable in hushed tones, hidden behind forced smiles and lowered gazes. Yet the venom stung all the same. To them, my habit was proof of emptiness. They said I parked there because I had nowhere else to go, because I was clinging to scraps of routine like a man afraid to let go of the past. They measured me not by the years I had carried this family, not by the sacrifices etched in my hands, but by the peeling paint of an old car. They thought I was ridiculous, just another relic that should be pushed out of sight. I remember watching them from a distance, their clothes crisp, their laughter rehearsed, as if each one of them were auditioning for a role in a play they barely understood. They didn't know that my silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint. They didn't know that the building they so proudly stood beside had risen from drawings I once sketched late at night under the dim light of a single lamp. They didn't know that the foundation beneath their polished shoes had carried the weight of my sweat, my fear, and my relentless determination to give them more than I ever had. But instead of gratitude, there was derision. Instead of respect, there were whispers that sliced like blades. It is a cruel thing to be laughed at by those whose comfort you built with your own hands. To stand at the edge of your own creation and be treated like a stranger trespassing. That curb, that corner, that space, they turned it into a symbol of my supposed irrelevance. And every time I turned the key in the ignition, every time the engine coughed and sputtered, I saw in their eyes the same unspoken thought. He is nothing now, just an old man clinging to scraps of dignity. But deep inside I held a quiet fire. The more they whispered, the stronger it burned. They thought I would never reply, and perhaps they were right. My words had already been spoken, years ago, in stone and steel, in walls and windows that bore my invisible signature. I didn't need to defend myself with arguments. One day I knew the truth would rise louder than their laughter, and the weight of my name would fall heavier than all their careless whispers combined. It didn't take long before their mockery became routine, woven into the fabric of each day like a cruel hymn sung in unison. They no longer whispered, they laughed openly, smirking when I turned the wheel into that corner space, as if my tires themselves confirmed their low opinion of me. For them it was entertainment, a ritual they repeated until it lost even the pretense of surprise. They waited for me to arrive, just to see me settle into that same spot, just to remind themselves that in their eyes I was small. But what they saw as weakness was something else entirely. That corner was not an accident, nor a stubborn old man's habit. It was the place where memory lived. Years ago, when this land was nothing but rubble and dreams, I had parked my first truck in that very space. I would step out with rolled blueprints under one arm and a toolbox in the other, my clothes stained with dust and sweat. The air was sharp with the smell of raw cement and iron beams, but to me it smelled like hope. That corner had been my anchor, the vantage point from which I watched the skeleton of the building rise higher each week. It was where I learned to carry failure without breaking, where I promised myself that my children would never know the hunger and fear that once shaped me. Every dent in my old car, every crack in the leather, carried echoes of that promise. To them it was a rusted shell. To me, it was a vessel of stories. When I sat behind the wheel, I didn't see ridicule. I saw the shadows of younger hands, gripping the wheel, trembling but determined. I saw nights spent too tired to speak, but still driving home with quiet pride that I had made it through another day. And yet, each morning as I turned into that corner, they laughed. Each laugh was a dagger disguised as a smile. It wasn't about the car, not really. It was about erasing me, about reducing me to a background figure in the very story I had written. Their ritual wasn't just mockery. It was an attempt to rewrite history, to make themselves believe I had never mattered, that my only place was at the edges, in the shadows, out of sight. But I endured. I let their laughter echo against the walls, because I knew those walls had been born of my labor. The glass windows that reflected their smug faces had been lifted by my design. The ground beneath their polished shoes had been poured by hands that once bled through gloves. They thought I clung to a corner out of stubbornness, but the truth was simpler. That corner was where my dreams began, and no amount of mockery could strip that meaning from me. One day, I told myself, they would see it. Not through my words, not through my protests, but through the undeniable weight of truth. And when that day came, their ritual would end, not in laughter, but in silence so heavy it would choke every careless smile from their lips. When the guests came, the tone of mockery shifted into something sharper, dressed in the velvet of false politeness. My children would smile at me with that practiced sweetness and say, "Dad, could you please park a little farther today? We need the closer spaces for people who matter." It was never shouted, never cruel on the surface, just carefully wrapped humiliation, disguised as courtesy. And yet it cut deeper than laughter. To be told you were less important than a stranger in your own family's home, To be measured against guests who would forget this night the moment it ended was a wound that never fully closed. I obeyed in silence. I turned the wheel, drove past the front, and slid into the shadows, my tires crunching against gravel at the far edge of the lot. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was only a few extra steps, that I had walked farther roads when my legs were young and the world was harder. But it did matter, because every time I parked in that distant corner, I wasn't just moving my car. I was being moved out of their story, pushed further from the circle of belonging. I became a figure they could set aside, an afterthought to be tucked into the dark edges while the spotlight shone on others. I remember watching the guests step out of polished cars, their laughter carried on the evening air, while I closed my door softly, quietly, as though even the sound of my presence would be an intrusion. They didn't see me then. They never did. I was the invisible man who built the walls they leaned on, the silent figure walking from the farthest corner, carrying not just the weight of years, but the weight of dismissal. The sting was not in the distance, but in the message, that I was no longer considered someone to be seen, that my presence was less valuable than the empty chatter of people who had never lifted a stone, who had never stayed awake through nights of labor so that this family could stand proud today. They treated me like a relic, fragile and unnecessary, a shadow to be tucked away so that the world could see only their polished pride. And yet, as I walked across the lot in silence, I carried something they did not: memory. I knew that every inch of this building, every light that glowed in the windows, every polished stone in the walls, had once been nothing but dust until I touched it. They had forgotten. They wanted me forgotten. But the walls themselves remembered. The foundations still whispered my name in silence, and I knew that one day, when the truth rose like the morning sun, no polite dismissal could ever banish me again. It was my birthday, though no one seemed to remember what that meant. I arrived early, hoping for a moment of quiet, a moment where I could believe they still cared. The lot was mostly empty, the building standing tall in the morning light, and for once I thought, perhaps today they will look at me differently. Perhaps today the years I gave, the sacrifices I made, will mean something again. But before I could even turn off the engine, they came. My son with his impatient tone, and my son-in-law with that smug half-smile, pointed toward the corner and said words that struck harder than any blow. "That's your spot, old man. Don't embarrass us by pulling up front." The sentence hung in the air, cruel not because of the volume, but because of the certainty. They believed I truly belonged there, in the shadows, in the farthest corner, in silence. Laughter followed, sharp and careless, and it echoed against the building I had once watched rise from nothing. No one noticed the way my hands tightened on the wheel. No one saw the weight pressing into my chest, heavy as stone. They thought I was too old to feel it, too tired to care, but in that moment I felt every year, every sacrifice, every scar, carried for their comfort, being mocked as if it were nothing. My birthday became not a celebration of life, but a reminder of how invisible I had become. I parked where they told me, in the corner, and stepped out quietly, while their laughter still clung to the air. They went inside, their voices bright with the excitement of their own importance, while I lingered outside for a moment, staring at the walls I had once built brick by brick. I remembered the night I spent pouring foundations here, on my own birthday decades ago, sweating under the moonlight, telling myself that one day my children would walk through these doors with pride, never knowing the hunger or hardship I endured. I gave them that future, and yet, standing in the lot now, I was treated as though I had given nothing at all. I swallowed the bitterness, not because it wasn't there, but because I knew if I spoke, my voice would break, and they would laugh at that too. So I walked inside with my head lowered, letting them believe their words had no power, but inside the wound bled. A birthday is supposed to be a reminder that your life matters, that your existence has weight. Instead, mine became proof to them that I was expendable, a man reduced to a corner in the parking lot and a corner in their hearts. What they didn't realize was that birthdays are not just for celebration. They are for remembering. And though they forgot me, I had not forgotten myself. I carried memories sharper than their cruelty, memories that tied me to this place more deeply than they would ever understand. One day, I told myself, they would be forced to remember too. One day, when the truth they ignored stood in front of them like an immovable wall, they would see who I truly was. And on that day, it would be too late for laughter. They thought their laughter erased me, that by mocking my car and my corner they were burying me in silence. But they never knew what I kept locked away, quiet and untouched, in a drawer no one bothered to open. Inside were not trinkets or sentimental scraps, but the proof of a lifetime's work. Every deed, every receipt, every contract, with my name etched at the bottom. Stacks of paper, yellowed at the edges, carried more truth than all their words combined. While they dismissed me as a burden, the ink on those pages burned with permanence, louder than their laughter, sharper than their scorn. Brick by brick, floor by floor, I had built what they now claimed as theirs. They walked through polished halls without ever wondering whose signature had first given life to steel and stone. They sat in bright offices without knowing the sleepless nights that had birthed them. They boasted about owning pieces of what was mine, forgetting that ownership is not about who boasts loudest, but whose name history will keep. Each insult they threw became fuel. When my son-in-law smirked and told me to park in the shadows, I remembered the day I signed the first permit. When my children rolled their eyes at my old car, I thought of the trucks I had once filled with supplies, hauling them myself when money was scarce. They forgot the weight of what I carried, but the documents in that drawer had never forgotten me. The ink did not fade, and neither did the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I would take the folder out and spread the pages across the table. My eyes would trace the letters of my name again and again, steady, undeniable, unerasable. And in those quiet hours, I felt no need to shout, no desire to argue, because the walls they leaned on, the roofs they lived under, the floors beneath their feet, all of it bore my invisible handwriting. I had written myself into the bones of that building, into the marrow of its foundation. They thought I was clinging to a habit, to a parking spot, to scraps of dignity. But I was holding something far stronger, the record of truth. And while their laughter might echo for a season, ink endures longer than breath. I knew that someday, when the drawer was finally opened, when those papers were laid out for all to see, the brightness of that truth would burn away every shadow of mockery, and the weight of my name, signed again and again across the years, would fall heavier than all their scorn combined. It happened on a day like any other, but cruelty has a way of choosing its moments with precision. I had barely stepped out of my car when my son-in-law, smugness dripping from every word, said loud enough for others to hear, "You should be grateful we let you park at all." The sentence was short, but it carried the weight of years of dismissal, years of being pushed aside, years of being treated as if I were trespassing on ground I had carved with my own hands. His words struck not because they were new, but because they were final, spoken with the arrogance of someone who truly believed I had no place left in the story I began. That evening, when the house was quiet and shadows pressed against the windows, I walked to the old cabinet where I kept the pieces of my life that no one cared to see. My fingers trembled as I pulled open the drawer, not from weakness, but from the heaviness of memory. A thick folder sat there, edges worn, the paper inside carrying the faint smell of dust and time. I lifted it carefully, as if holding something fragile, though in truth it was stronger than steel. The weight of it in my hands reminded me of the weight of my life's work. I laid the folder on the table and opened it. Dust rose into the air, swirling in the dim light, but beneath it lay truth that no insult could erase. Page after page, documents stacked with dates, stamps, and signatures, all bearing my name. My eyes stopped on the most important of them all, the building's title. Not theirs, not shared, mine, etched in permanence, sealed in ink that had outlived the laughter, the whispers, the polite dismissals. For years they had walked through its doors, boasting of its grandeur, mocking me as if I were a stranger at its edges, and yet, all along, it was mine. In that moment, I felt no anger, only clarity. Their cruelty had built a wall around me, but within that wall, I still held the foundation. Every insult, every humiliation, had only sharpened the truth, waiting quietly in the dark. My son-in-law thought I should be grateful for a parking space, but it was he who stood under my roof, he who breathed within walls that carried my signature, he who lived under the shadow of a name he could never erase. I closed the folder gently, the echo of paper folding sounding louder than any laughter that had once filled my ears. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without bitterness. Because I knew the day was coming when the silence I had endured would shatter, when truth would no longer hide in drawers but stand tall in front of every mocking eye. And when that day came, they would not laugh, they would not whisper, they would only see what had been there all along, the permanence of my name. The next morning, as sunlight crept through the curtains, I sat at the edge of my bed with the folder resting on my lap. My hands brushed over the cover, feeling the weight of decades pressed between its pages. There was no need for fury, no need for revenge carried on raised voices. The truth had no use for noise. It only required patience, and I had waited long enough. With steady fingers, I reached for the phone. The line rang once, twice, then a voice answered. Calm, professional, familiar. I spoke without trembling, though my heart carried the weight of years. Bring the documents tomorrow. They'll be there. Nothing more, nothing less. No explanation, no pleading, just a simple request, spoken with the quiet authority of a man who knows he still holds the final word. On the other end, there was no hesitation, only agreement, because the truth written in ink was stronger than any denial my family had ever thrown at me. When I set the phone down, the silence in the room felt different. For years, silence had been heavy with humiliation, a cloak I wore because I refused to shout against their mockery. But now, the silence was powerful, steady, alive with justice moving in ways they could not see. It was like ink drying on parchment, silent, unhurried, but permanent. That day I went about my routines as if nothing had changed. I walked through the halls, passed by the faces that had dismissed me, listened to their careless laughter as though I were invisible. They never knew that every step I took carried a secret they could not imagine. They thought I was fading into irrelevance, but the ground they stood on was already shifting, preparing to reveal the truth they had buried beneath their arrogance. I looked once more at the building as the evening settled, its windows glowing in the fading light. They called it theirs, claimed it as their pride, mocked me as a relic standing in its shadow. But tomorrow the shadow would turn, and it would not fall on me. It would fall on them, reminding each of them whose name had been carved into its very bones. Justice does not always arrive with fire or fury. Sometimes it comes in the quiet turning of a page, in the calm of a phone call, in the steady patience of ink waiting to be read. And as night closed in, I knew tomorrow would be the beginning. The moment's silence would no longer be weakness, but the voice of truth, undeniable and unerasable. The next evening, the lobby glowed with golden light, polished marble floors reflecting the glitter of pride that walked across them. My children, their spouses, their friends, each one dressed in their finest clothes, their laughter sharp, their arrogance heavier than the chandeliers that hung above. They filled the air with self-importance, speaking of business deals and family prestige, as if the building itself existed to showcase their grandeur. None of them looked toward the door. None of them thought of me. To them, I was already assigned to the margins, a shadow to be tolerated, not a presence to be welcomed. I arrived last, stepping quietly inside, my old shoes barely making a sound against the stone I had once chosen myself. The air was thick with perfume, with the clinking of glasses, with the hollow sound of false pride. No one paused when I entered. To them, I was just another background figure, an old man sliding into the corner, unworthy of notice. They did not realize that the very walls they leaned against had once risen under my hands, that the ceiling above them had been carried on my back long before they were old enough to mock. I stood at the edge, watching them bask in the glow of something they believed belonged to them. Their arrogance was not loud. It was casual, effortless, the kind of pride that comes when people are so sure the ground beneath them is theirs. They gestured, they boasted, they claimed pieces of a legacy they never earned. Each word struck like a dagger, not because I still doubted my worth, but because I saw how completely they had erased me from the story. But as I stood in the shadows, I felt no rage, only a steady calm, the kind that comes when the end of a long silence draws near. My folder was in the hands of the lawyer now, the truth waiting just beyond their sight. And though they laughed and smiled, though they wore arrogance like a crown, I knew what was coming. Their pride was built on sand, and within moments the tide would rise. For years they had pushed me into corners, forced me into silence, treated me as though I had no place in the life I had built. And now here I stood, invisible in their eyes, watching them boast beneath ceilings that whispered my name. They thought I was nothing but a shadow slipping into the room, but they would learn that even shadows belong to a body, and that the body they tried to erase had written itself into every stone of this place. Soon the silence would break. Soon the truth would walk out of the shadows and stand in the center, and their arrogance would collapse beneath its weight. The lawyer's voice cut through the laughter like a blade through silk. He cleared his throat, and at once the echo of pride in the lobby dimmed, as though the building itself had leaned in to listen. "Before we begin," he said evenly, "a clarification of ownership must be made." The words seemed harmless, a mere formality, and I watched the smirks bloom on familiar faces. My son-in-law raised his glass as if expecting some minor correction, perhaps another excuse to parade his arrogance. My children exchanged knowing glances, amused by what they assumed was routine legal chatter. They did not yet realize that the ground beneath them was about to shift. The lawyer unfolded the first page. The faint rustle of paper seemed louder than their shallow laughter had been, a sound that carried weight. The air grew heavy, a silence pressed in, uneasy and sharp. Their smirks faltered when his eyes met the words inked decades ago, when his voice spoke not of their names, not of their claims, but of mine. Line by line, the truth began to breathe in that room. The title, the seal, the signature, they had all believed themselves owners, heirs, rightful possessors of this building. But with every word read aloud, their illusions cracked. My name echoed from the page, repeated, undeniable, etched in permanence. My daughter lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening on the stem of her glass. My son's jaw clenched as though the words were striking him one by one. My son-in-law shifted uncomfortably, the color draining from his face, the smirk collapsing into silence. I stood still in the corner, my hands folded, my face calm. For years they had laughed as I parked in the shadows, ridiculed me for clinging to routine, banished me politely to the edges. And now, with one sheet of paper, the truth they had buried rose to the surface. The very walls they leaned upon, the marble under their feet, the ceilings above their heads, all of it carried my name, not theirs. The silence that filled the lobby was no longer the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of realization, of pride breaking beneath the weight of undeniable fact. They had believed themselves untouchable, but arrogance has no defense against ink that does not fade. What they thought would be a trivial formality had become a mirror reflecting the truth they had refused to see. And in that mirror, they saw themselves not as owners, not as heirs, but as guests. Guests standing in a building that bore a name they had mocked, a name they had cast aside, a name they could never erase. Line after line, the lawyer's voice carried the truth, steady and unwavering, each syllable pressing heavier against the walls than their laughter ever had. The title was not scattered with many names, not shared among heirs or diluted with pretenses. It bore one name only, my own. Not the son who had rolled his eyes at me, not the daughter who had hidden her shame behind polite smiles, not the son-in-law who had dared to tell me I should be grateful for a corner in the lot. Just mine. The man they mocked for a parking spot, the man they dismissed as irrelevant, the man they believed had no place left at the table. As the words fell, their faces changed. My son's smirk drained into stone, his lips parting but no sound escaping. My daughter blinked rapidly, as though trying to erase the words before they reached her ears, her hand trembling around the glass she held. And the son-in-law, once so bold in his arrogance, stared with wide, unblinking eyes, his throat moving as though he had swallowed fire. They had lived under the illusion that I was a relic clinging to scraps, but now the weight of reality pressed down upon them, undeniable, unerasable. The silence in that lobby was suffocating. No one dared to speak because the truth had already spoken louder than any of them ever could. It was written in black ink, sealed in signatures, stamped with authority that no amount of pride or mockery could undo. Every page was a reminder that they had feasted in a house built by my labor, that they had stood on foundations poured by my sweat, that they had laughed in the shadows of walls that carried my name. I watched them not with anger, not with triumph, but with the steady calm of a man who had carried the burden of silence for too long. They had stripped me of dignity in front of strangers, pushed me into corners, laughed at the old car that had once hauled the very materials that built this place. And yet, here we stood, and the building itself testified against them. It spoke through paper, through ink, through names that could not be erased. My name. And in that moment, I no longer felt the sting of humiliation. Their laughter, their whispers, their dismissals, all of it collapsed beneath the truth. For they had tried to make me invisible, but the title made me unshakable. They had mocked my parking space, but the ground beneath their feet declared that the space belonged to me. Every letter of my name was a stone in the wall of justice, and there was nothing they could do to tear it down. Their faces told the story before their lips could form words. Pride drained into pale disbelief. Arrogance curdled into fear. The room that had moments ago been filled with easy laughter now stood frozen, as though the very air had turned against them. My son's shoulders sagged, his confidence collapsing under the weight of a truth he could not bend. My daughter's eyes shimmered with tears she fought to contain, the polite mask she wore for years shattering in silence. And the son-in-law, the loudest voice, the sharpest tongue, stumbled backward, his words cracking before they even left his mouth. This can't be." His voice was hollow, trembling, stripped of the venom it once carried, but it was. The seal glistened on the page, undeniable, unmovable, a mark of permanence they could not laugh away. The ink was older than their arrogance, deeper than their pride, and it spoke with a power no insult could rival. All their mockery, the cruel smirks, the whispered derision, crumbled into nothing, turned to dust in their throats. They had built their laughter on the belief that I was powerless, irrelevant, a man to be tucked into corners and forgotten. And yet, with one page, one voice reading the truth aloud, everything they had built collapsed in silence. The son-in-law tried again, his hands shaking as though he could claw back the certainty that had always protected him. But his words failed, strangled by the echo of my name repeated across the documents. My children stood beside him, their eyes lowered, unable to meet mine, the weight of shame pressing their heads down. The building itself seemed to grow taller around us, as though the stone and glass had chosen their allegiance, as though every beam remembered whose sweat had lifted it into place. I did not speak. I didn't need to. Justice was not mine to shout. It was already there, unfolding in the silence, in their trembling, in the undeniable presence of truth that had waited patiently through years of mockery. They had stripped me of dignity in front of strangers, but dignity is not something others can give or take. Dignity returns when the truth rises. And so I stood still, watching as their laughter dissolved into ashes. Their eyes, once sharp with arrogance, now darted helplessly, like children caught in a lie too large to escape. For the first time in years, I felt the weight lift from my chest. They had banished me to the shadows, but tonight it was their pride that stood in darkness, and I, the man they thought invisible, was revealed in the light of a truth they could never erase. I did not raise my voice. I did not let triumph curl into a smile or bitterness spill into words. I stood there, hands steady, face calm, while the silence itself became my answer. For years they had mocked, dismissed, and banished me to the edges. But in that moment I understood. Justice does not need fury to be felt. It arrives quietly, like the turning of the earth, like the steady breath of stone foundations that hold a building upright. It was not my anger that defeated them. It was the truth, patient and unmovable, waiting all along for the day it would be revealed. Their eyes searched me, desperate for reaction, but I gave them none. My son's lips trembled, ready to plead, but the words died before they formed. My daughter's hands fidgeted against her dress, the polished fabric now clinging to her shame like chains. My son-in-law, once so loud in his arrogance, stood like a statue cracked in the middle, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. They expected rage, a storm of long-suppressed fury, but all they received was stillness, stillness that weighed heavier than any scream. For years, they believed they had buried me under humiliation. But humiliation cannot bury a man whose life is written in ink and stone. Betrayal had spoken first, yes, and it had spoken loudly, at dinners where I was silenced, at celebrations where I was pushed aside, in parking lots where I was ordered to remain in shadows. But betrayal's voice fades. Truth does not. Truth waits, like steel beneath paint, like roots beneath soil, like foundations holding up the very house in which they laughed at me. I looked at the title, my name pressed into its surface, and I felt no need to boast. Because justice is not about revenge. It is about restoration. It is the return of weight to the shoulders of those who had cast it off. It is the silence after arrogance breaks, the stillness after mockery crumbles, the unshakable fact that no insult can erase. And so I let the silence stretch, let it fall on them like a heavy cloak. I did not speak, for the truth was speaking louder than any voice in that room. And in that stillness they understood at last. The man they thought they had erased was the very one who had written the story they lived in. I did not need to win. I had already built, and my work, my name, my truth, those were the justice that stood taller than them all. Her eyes betrayed her before her lips could. My daughter, who once laughed behind her hand, who once told guests with polite cruelty that I insisted on parking in the shadows, now stood trembling, her lashes heavy with tears she could no longer hold back. She remembered every smirk, every moment she allowed her silence to join the mockery, every word she had sharpened against me when she thought I was too old, too small, too irrelevant to feel. And in that instant, she saw me differently, not as the man with a rusted car and tired shoes, but as the architect of her life, the builder of the very walls sheltering her pride, the true owner of everything above her head. Regret fell on her like a sudden storm. Her fingers tightened around her dress, her knuckles white, as though she wanted to clutch at something slipping away. She saw herself reflected in the ink on the page, but not in the way she had hoped. She was not heir, not rightful owner, not the keeper of the legacy she believed was hers. She was simply a daughter who had turned her back on the man who had carved the path she walked. And now that path curved back to her, heavy with truth. My son stood pale beside her, his pride cracked open, his jaw rigid, as though holding back words he no longer knew how to shape. The arrogance they once wore like armor now hung on them like chains. They realized the cruelty they thought harmless, laughter at dinners, whispers at curbs, sneers at parking spaces, had been knives cutting into the very hands that had lifted them higher than they deserved. And my daughter, in her tears, seemed to carry them all. She saw not the old man they had mocked, but the foundation she had ignored. She remembered childhood nights when I worked late but still came home with enough strength to lift her into bed. She remembered the warmth of meals cooked with money I had earned by blistered hands. She remembered the promises I had fulfilled without complaint, and now every memory twisted into a blade of guilt. Regret is heavier than anger, heavier than shame, heavier than silence. It sat on her shoulders, pressing her into herself, until she could no longer lift her head to meet my eyes. I did not move toward her, did not comfort her, did not reach to wipe her tears. That was not my role anymore. Justice had spoken, and it spoke not with fury, but with the weight of realization crushing her heart. She had called me unnecessary. She had stood by when others mocked me, and now she saw what she had failed to see all along, that I was never the shadow in the corner, but the cornerstone beneath her life. And though her tears fell, they could not wash away the truth written in ink, nor the weight of regret that would follow her long after the silence of that night. I did not wait for their apologies. I did not linger to savor their silence or to watch their pride collapse further under the weight of truth. When the last page was folded and the lawyer's voice fell quiet, I simply turned and walked away. My steps were steady, unhurried, each one carrying the strength of years they had chosen to forget. Behind me, the lobby was frozen, filled not with laughter, but with a silence that clawed at their throats. They had mocked me for a parking space, dismissed me as a shadow at the edge of their world, but now they stood trembling inside a structure that bore my name in every hidden corner. I walked out into the cool night air, the building glowing behind me. My car, worn and weathered, waited faithfully in the space they had ridiculed me for. That corner, once the emblem of their mockery, now felt like a throne. I opened the door and rested my hand on the wheel, and for the first time in years, my chest felt light. I did not need to drive away in triumph. The truth itself was the victory, and it echoed louder than any engine ever could. As I sat there, I glanced once at the building, towering against the dark sky. Every floor, every window, every light, it all spoke my name, not in whispers, not in shadows, but in permanence. They had believed I was a man, clinging to habit, chained to the past, fading into irrelevance. But in reality, they had lived their entire lives inside the legacy I had built for them. My name was not carved only into paper. It was written into steel beams, into poured foundations, into the very walls that would stand long after all of us were gone. The spot they mocked remained empty when I finally turned the key and pulled away. But emptiness is not always absence. Sometimes it is proof. That corner was no longer a place of humiliation. It was a monument to patience, to endurance, to the quiet certainty that truth does not need to rush. They thought they had confined me there, but in truth, I had chosen it. Because from that place, I could see it all: the beginning, the rise, the legacy. And so I left without looking back, because I didn't need to. They would spend years remembering that night, replaying the sound of the lawyer's voice, feeling the sting of their own laughter turning into ash. They would walk those halls with lowered eyes, unable to forget whose name held them up. My children, my in-laws, all of them would live under a shadow they could never escape. Not the shadow of my car in the corner, but the shadow of my name, unshakable, unerasable. Betrayal had tried to make me small. Mockery had tried to erase me. But names built on truth do not vanish. They become legacy. And mine stood tall that night, taller than arrogance, louder than scorn, stronger than time. They had mocked my place, but the ground they stood on had always belonged to me. And no betrayal, not laughter, not whispers, not polite cruelty, could ever erase that.